contact center industry influencer. He is the president of Call Center Coach, host of the Fast Leader Show podcast, and host of the Contact Center Virtual Summit and the CX Success Summit. He is a certified emotional intelligence practitioner, employee retention specialist, better place to work expert, team quotient expert, and an empty mapping expert. And if that isn't enough, he's crazy enough to be a middle school baseball coach. So Jim, thank you for joining us today, and I will turn the floor over to you.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Gosh, listening to that stuff kind of oftentimes causes me to forget, some of those humble beginnings that I think many of you are going through. But first of all, I want to make sure that I share a special thank you to Aisha, Grayson, Jeremy, Kevin, Lisa, Mark, Sean, Sherry, and to all of you who are taking the time to participate in this webinar. I really appreciate you. And what I need to make a promise, and that my promise to you is that by the end of this webinar, you'll know how to unleash contact center performance. And I'm talking about taking it to levels that you've never even imagined or that you've always wished. And you could say, you know what, we're doing pretty good right now. And you know what, you probably are, because otherwise you'd be out of business, right? So you are doing pretty good. You're doing a lot of things good. And it's important to recognize those and appreciate those. But the reality is that we can always increase performance. And there's one way that really just blows it out the water. And we're going to talk about that and some of the things that really impacted me. But also, it's not just about information. It's about how do you apply what you're getting ready to learn. And so what I'm going to make available to you, and you have to stay till the end of the webinar. You see it, we're calling it a webinar. But if you stay to the end, you'll get all of these tools, and I'll upload it so that you can actually, underneath the chat window, at least that's what I see on my side, is you can download the file. It's a PDF file, but you got to stay to the end, and I'll make that available to you. Okay, it's going to have all these tools in it. Reality is that I started in the contact center industry and on the front line. And for me, when I had the opportunity to take a supervisor role within the contact center, it's probably like many of you, and if you're not a supervisor, it's like many of the supervisors that you currently have in your contact center, is that you were just put into that role. Hey, you were good at this, so now I need you to do that and supervise the performance and development and of these people that are on your team. I understood nothing about key performance indicators. I mean, workforce management, what the heck was that? I had no access also to any type of learning whatsoever, because for me, if you kind of reflect back on seeing that picture of me, is I started in contact centers, back in the 1990s. So it's been a while. I've been in the industry a very long time. And when I started looking at, when I started, we had very, very inexperienced staff and leaders. I mean, back then, nobody knew anything about contact centers. It was all brand new. And I would dare to say for a lot of you, you might be experiencing that now as well. I have talked to a lot of, for example, senior level leaders. They're like, hey, I've never been on the front line, and I've been given the responsibility to lead this contact center. And so for them, it's quite difficult for them to really know what's needed in order to be successful at that front line or on the front line. So, I mean, I struggled. Now, good thing, bad thing is I'm hard-headed, and I don't like to fail. So I did whatever I could in order to, be as successful as I possibly could. And so I sought out, different resources. There were very, very few back then in order to be able to help me with my development to be better at being a frontline supervisor. And so I stuck with it. I kept pushing. I kept trying to, I'm forever committed to learning. Chris mentioned some of those things that I've done to continue my development, which is, different certifications and things like that. For me, my philosophy is that when I quit learning should be the day that I take my last breath. I am committed to continuing to learn as much as I possibly can. And so I've had the opportunity to thrive as a result of my commitment and been recognized as, an industry influencer. I even had the opportunity to be on the board of directors for the Divers Alert Network, which is part of Duke University, because of my contact center experience. They needed somebody that had that experience in order to help them from a strategic perspective. So while the reality is you can thrive too, and because despite of all the things that I'm just going to share with you today that were stacked against people like me and like many of you and like others in your contact center, you can thrive, but you got to know how to do that. And so for me, I've done a lot of things right. I have. But I've done a ton of things wrong. And, you know, like I said, I'm hard-headed and I've persevered. And so after what I've learned after so many years of doing this is that, first of all, turnover, it is not an industry problem. I hear too many times people say, well, it's just the nature of our industry. And yet I always find people who don't have that problem, organizations and contact centers that don't have a turnover problem. And you may say, well, they're small centers and they're in a certain niche, and that's just not true. Some of them don't have an issue. And there's reasons why. We'll get into that. Also, you don't want to do what everybody else is doing. I mean, following the common practices is really dumb, especially in today's day and age. It used to be, and I'm certain, you know, some of you who've been around for a while, you know, can reflect back and say, well, you know, 10 years ago, things were quite different, you know, and I used to say that as well. And then things started accelerating at an even greater rate. And so then it's like, well, things were different 5 years ago. And so now, if you're looking back more than 3 years ago, it's a whole different world in our contact center industry. So many things are changing, and that pace of change is accelerating as well. And what I also learned is that in order to be able to develop supervisors and their leadership skills, it's not an event. You can't send them to a workshop. You can't send them to a class. You can't send and expect them to come out and be successful. That's not the way it works. And we'll talk about that as well. So for me, I took the hard road, and as I also mentioned, the very long road. It was a long, hard road. So I'm going to share with you some things that will help you to cheat and get to the easy way a heck of a lot faster. And I want to give you some data, and I'm going to give you some practical things that you can do in order to be able to really, again, unlock that secret weapon in your contact center. Because here's the reality that we know, is the study shows that 80% of agents leave because of their supervisor. It's because of their immediate supervisor. Culture, retention, all of those things are done locally at the team level. To back that up, there was a recent book that was released by the Gallup organization, and I gave you a little bit of quote from that, but I kind of want to. I got this book in front of me, and on page 12 in the introduction, this is what the actual paragraph says. It says, of all the codes Gallup has been asked to crack, dating back 80 years to our founder George Gallup, the single most profound, distinct, and clarifying finding ever is probably this one. 70% of the variance in team engagement is determined solely by the manager. It's that frontline supervisor that is managing those teams. Now, you may say that's a significant burden to put on their shoulders, and you know what? You're right. It is. So what we have to do is give them what they need in order to make sure that they're not the cause of these agents burning out and leaving. And so I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Jim Harder on my podcast, The Fast Leader Show. And if you go to fastleader.net, look for episode 231, and you can get access to the full interview with Jim. You can also get access to the Fast Leader Show on all these different podcast platforms as well, because he shares a lot of different things about being more effective as a leader and engagement. So here's what we also know is that 1 in 3 employees said that they feel their supervisor is ineffective. They don't have confidence. They don't have trust. If they don't trust the competencies and skills of their immediate supervisor, what is that going to cause? It's going to cause a lot of problems, and they're definitely not going to be connected to your organization, right? So it's going to be easier for them to consider other alternatives and other opportunities a lot faster because they don't trust the supervisor, their leader. And also when you look at it from the other side, if you look at people who are responsible for selecting frontline leaders, only 18% of organizations feel that they have an actual ample supply of employees to fill those roles. So when you look at your agent population and grooming, finding people of that population to be leaders, people aren't finding a lot. So we have an opportunity. And here's another thing that we also know is that more than 50% of contact center supervisors fail. That's just straight up fail. So let's talk about the whole learning curve. So if we're talking about a learning curve taking several months, a couple years, how many agents are they taking out in the process, in the learning curve process? These people don't hit the ground running with success. It's not the way it works. So we have a crisis situation. When you start talking about a lot of the things that are going on in our industry and that have been going on, this is an age-old problem. This is things that we've been talking about for decades in our industry. We're in a crisis. And so also when you start looking at the things that most contact centers deal with, the things that they struggle with the most, you can look at the results of mediocre frontline leaders. What does that cause? And if you look at these things that they cause, I mean, you're like, yep. I mean, these are things that we all see and that we all know now that can be prevented. We can actually reduce and improve the performance of these frontline supervisors. And also when you look at the 12 reasons why they fail, if you look at these things, there is nothing about the competency and skill of what it is that they're doing for the organization. It's not about what you know about the company and your products and services. It's not about that. It's about how you lead others and how you develop others. That's why they fail. And also when you start looking at the complexity, I mentioned this a moment ago, it's accelerating at an increasing rate, is that technology makes it even more difficult to be a better leader because things are just coming at you at a faster rate. And and if you don't have the good foundation and the core competencies of being a good leader, it just makes it that much more hard. And so if you look at a poll, a survey that was done about 1,000 job seekers in the contact center industry, and asking why they left their previous, contact center, these are some of the reasons they gave. And the reality is that the frontline supervisor can impact every single one of these or the perception of them. So in this survey, you can look at these results right here. Basically, people aren't giving their full effort because of a lot of these factors. They don't have that competence. They don't have strong leaders, and therefore, they're not going to give their all. And you've done this for yourself because I know I have too. When I've had a good leader, a strong leader, I give better effort. And when I've had a weak one, that doesn't happen. It's just human nature. We know that that's the case. So if you actually understand retention and asking people and getting an understanding of why they actually stay and give effort, it's really these 5 things that come out. Is this feel like it's the right place and the right job? Do I really want to give my effort? Do I have the ability to make decisions and do the things that I feel are necessary in order to be successful, to obtain my performance metrics and goals and serve my customers? Am I being developed? Do I see, a way forward, or a deepening of my skills? What's the career path? And then am I appreciated for the work that I'm doing? These are the reasons why people stay. And again, the frontline supervisor can impact every single one of them. The reality is that the supervisor can impact every single metric you track, everyone, without fail. Sales, service metrics, customer experience metrics, productivity metrics, every single one can be impacted or influenced by that frontline supervisor. It's not buying a technology. So if I look at the career path of a supervisor and the development of a supervisor, and the fact is that almost all supervisors get promoted from the frontline agent positions. Well, and I even asked this question in another webinar, and somebody said, well, no, we actually hire, from outside as well. And I said, well, where do you think those people actually started? I mean, so basically every single agent that I know of, or supervisor that I know of, has really started on the front line with very few exceptions. So the question that you need to ask is, first of all, are we promoting the right people, into these particular roles? Because it is not. And there's one of the biggest mistakes that I see people making all the time in contact centers is that is not your best agent. It's not a given. That's not a situation where you can say, hey, you're good at being an individual contributor, and therefore you can now lead all these frontline people in their development. That does not translate. They're different competencies, and we'll talk about that in a second. And so then you have to look at, are we equipping them, talking about the development piece, whether they're grooming to be a new supervisor or an existing supervisor, are we giving them the needed skills and knowledge to be successful in their role? We have to continually ask those questions because things shift. And with the shift, whether it's customer needs, product needs, competitive influence, new product, all those shifts, we have to continually revisit that and ask this question. So when you start talking about finding the right mix of candidates for that frontline supervisor role, there's a lot of different ways, and the more that you deploy, the better success that you're going to have in selecting that right individual. So it's doing all of these things is going to be the best bet. And so if you start saying, what does that process look like? It varies for a lot of organizations. Some go through, streamlined processes. Some do not. They're very complex and they take a while. The point is that we all, regardless of whatever effort we make, want to make sure that it's the right individual that we put into the role, and also know once we do that, we're not done, right? There has to be more to it. Also, when you start looking at the attributes of top supervisors, and I give you the complete list in the bonus pack that I said if you stay to the end, I'll make available for you to download. But the single most important attribute is this top one, is that if a leader does not enjoy seeing the success of others, they're not going to be a successful leader. They should not be a leader. I mean, it should be one of those things that, the reality is that, you don't really care whether or not your people are successful or even surpass you. Because as a leader, you want your people to go past you when you're going to be a good leader and you have that commitment. So if you don't enjoy seeing others succeed, don't go for the role and the responsibility. You have to commit to it. And there's a lot of leaders that I've had to essentially have that conversation with, said, man, you don't care whether your people are successful or anybody else for that matter. So therefore, you should not be a leader. It just shouldn't happen. So there's several other attributes that are important as well, but this is the single most important one. So what are the other factors or competencies that supervisors must have in order to be successful? And so let's kind of take this back from a structure perspective. You have to, skills are built upon competencies. So if you're competent, or if you have certain competencies, you therefore can develop skills upon that. So if you could look at this and say, well, coaching is important. Where's coaching? Coaching is a skill. You need to have knowledge in these competencies in order for you to be a better coach. So looking at studying the success of contact center supervisors going back many years, what we have found is that in order for them to be successful, they need to be competent in these 6 areas. And then I don't have to read them for you. They're pretty clear. And here's the interesting point, is that even when you start talking about mid-level and senior-level leaders, they still need these same competencies. The difference is that they have to add a few others. But these competencies are foundational competencies for any level of leader. And you may stop and look at this and say, well, gosh, I have a senior level leader in my organization who's not good at 2 of these. Well, yeah, you're going to find that. Because what we do know when we start looking at that mediocre leader, they're not just on front line. They're at all levels. And we'll talk about that impact here in a moment as well. Okay. So what should supervisors be able to do when we start talking about these competencies? I'm not going to read this word for word. You guys can do that. And so when I start thinking about the supervisors and their abilities, it's also a learning curve situation. So in other words, a new supervisor is not going to be as effective as a tenured supervisor at being able to understand the core competencies and define them and do all of that. However, what we do need to know is that we have to do it, right? So, okay, I need to have skills in these competencies and then build them over time. Much going like I had said, building supervisor leadership skills is not an event. It takes time and continuous focus on those 6 core competencies. Leadership development is a learning journey. It's not an event. So when we start looking at other things that they need to be able to do, they need to be able to draw connections from the company to that front line and the work that's done in the front line and help people to be successful at it. So again, I'm not going to read these things. You can read them yourselves. Going into another competency is that, what else do they need to do? When you start talking about customer service skills and sales skills, and here's the reality is that service and sales are merging. You get better sales by providing a better service. You get better sales by actually making sure that you're serving and delivering on the needs of your customers. So having skills in both areas in service and sales is vitally important. And also, you say, well, maybe we're a little bit more internal tech driven, whatever. Same thing still applies from a service perspective and experience perspective. Here's the funny thing about communications and talking about communication and what supervisors need to be able to do is that if you were to ask somebody, do you have good communication skills? Who says no? When we think about communication skills, again, some of us are further along the development path than others. So some of us just have, good natural, abilities when it comes to communication. But the fact is we can all get better at it. And effective communication is changing without time. I mean, how many distractions do we have throughout our day? So if we communicate like we used to, that may not be the way that we need to. So we need to make adjustments. We always need to be looking at that and making changes for that. Also, when you start looking at other things that they need to be able to do, it really does come around being able to be very, very effective at building stronger teams. Because work gets done in today's world in a team environment. Also, when I had mentioned where does culture live, where does engagement live, it lives at the team level. Now, some of you who are on this webinar may be working in a remote type of environment. And if you are, guess what? You have to do some things a little bit differently in order to build a stronger team than those that are, able to see people face to face. And you need to know the differences. You need to be able to know what you need to do in order to be able to be more effective at having a stronger team, depending on the environment that you're in, depending on your hours of operation, depending on the product and services, depending on geographic location. All of those factors come into play, and the more skilled you are at leading people, the better you're going to be at that. Also, when you start talking about the front line and what does the front line do and the importance of the front line and the impact of the front line, and understanding all the metrics that are associated with that, supervisors need to be able to translate all of that. So if your frontline agents really don't know the impact that they have on the company, that's a responsibility of the supervisor. And so the supervisor has to build skills in that area because, it shifts. It's not always the same. Supervisor also needs to understand everything associated with queuing and workforce management and the impacts of that and adherence. All of those things are critically important. Being there when the customer needs us. I mean, being able to convey that in a way by which it engages people and not turns them off is important. So what they must be able to do are which one of these? All of them. Now, again, everybody's going to be at different starting points. And it's a journey and it's a success path. And you could say or ask the question, well, a lot of these kind of overlap. Yes, they do. They're interrelated. They all impact one another. But the fact is that I need to have a waypoint. I need to know and have a framework. I need to know what I am supposed to be doing so that I can be successful. And it's focusing on building skills in these 6 core competencies. So when you start talking about ways to assess your current supervisors, you can actually measure that. And it's part of your bonus kit for this webinar. I'll give you an audit that you can use. You can also use your on-job results, all of your key performance indicators. Some of you may be using a 360 review type process. You can also just test and evaluate their knowledge and skills. But most of it often comes down to, again, what's happening at that team level. Because we can know everything. I know it all, but it doesn't mean my behavior reflects that. So we could be having situations where the knowledge and skills, for example, are saying that, hey, they're competent, they know this stuff, but it doesn't mean they're able to apply it. So again, it's a continuous effort that we need to be focusing in on and making sure that our behaviors reflect what we know. And so how do you do that? Well, first of all, development, again, is a journey. There's a lot of different ways that we learn. So we learn in community of one another. Right now, we're not quite in community because everybody's line is muted, but having the opportunity to interact and understand other people's perspectives and their environments, I mean, all of those things help us to learn. That's why being part of the association is so critically important. Engage with your association. Learn the perspectives of others. Don't only stare at your 4 walls and expect that you're going to learn more. That's not the way that it works. So you need to have access to short micro-learning, get access to very brief information on demand when you want it, participate in interactive types of things with the Q&A. We're going to have a small one coming up here in a little bit. Also be challenged. That's what boot camps are. They're challenge courses. Do something different, learn new behaviors. Also learn about this industry that we're in. It's dynamic. It's very diverse. And when you start thinking about creative thinking, it comes from getting different perspectives and then putting some of those things together to make something new for ourselves. That's how innovation occurs. And then also, yes, do some structured training. That's important. So it's being able to blend all this. Because what we do know is that when you look at the modern learner, they engage in development when they need it. And this is a recent study that shows where it happens. It happens all over the place. And also when you start talking about the supervisor of today, especially our younger generation, and that's one of the things that came out in the study from the Gallup book, It's the Manager, and Dr. Harder's work, and we talk about that on the podcast, is that is an expectation of the younger worker of today, is that you're going to continuously develop me. So here's the reality when you start talking about supervisors that aren't mediocre, the ones that are the higher performers. If you're not continuing to develop them, you think they're going to stay. It's not going to happen. And if you think you're just going to give them, a particular training class and have them sit in and that's going to suffice, you're wrong. It has to be ongoing, continuous development. So remember, more than 50% of new contact center supervisors fail. That metric can't continue. That performance can't continue as an industry, because what I want to prevent is that I don't want any person to ever say when they quit their contact center job that they never want to work in one of those again. We don't want to burn people out of our industry. There's too many opportunities that need to be filled and too many good people that we need to retain. We need to do a better job of that. So we've got to line up all of these elements of success, not have sporadic events, and understand that it's a journey in order to be able to unlock the potential of these people. So you have to ask yourself, are our supervisors really super right now with what we're giving them? It's not likely. It's a reality we have to face. Because when you start looking at what companies do to develop their frontline contact supervisors, you know what that typically looks like? It looks like, okay, here's some training to teach you how to keep us out of court. Here's some training on how to use our systems. Here's some training on how to understand our products and services better. It's not about their leadership development. And also, if it is, they get generic leadership development that is an event. It's like, hey, attend this class. Hey, take this course. But again, we've already established people need access to learning and development when they need it, whenever they can get to it. It does need to have some structure. It does need to have also some free-form capabilities and on-demand capabilities. So we could make our supervisors super. We could, and unleash this secret weapon. Talking about the performance, every single KPI we impact can be affected if we do a better job of developing those people. So you have to start where you are. So if you want to keep learning about some of the core competencies that need to be developed by these supervisors and things that we deal with in the contact center, I suggest checking out these other episodes on the Fast Leader Show, because like the first one with Susan Fowler, when you start looking at how we often try to motivate people, we're doing the wrong thing. And we're repeating it. And we're spending a lot of money on doing it. And what I mean is we're investing in things that are just foolish. Talking about the Gallup in the introduction, a paragraph after they talked about that single most important determining factor being the manager, in here they say, clever benefit packages, new scoring systems, free lunches, and on-site volleyball courts are great, but they don't change outcomes. Only improving your ratio of great to lousy managers does. You need more great managers. Also, you have the opportunity of learning about many of these core competencies at the Contact Center Virtual Summit. So I would highly suggest checking it out. You can get free access. That's going to be open up and available here within the next several weeks. So, we can continue learning and get access to over 35 contact center supervisors where we look at what I call the agent life cycle. It's hiring, onboarding, leading, developing, and retaining. And you can get access to all of those leaders by going to ccvirtualsummit.com. Now, I promised you that by the end of this webinar, you'll know how to unleash contact center performance. You've been given all the information that you need to have about how to go about doing that. But doing it is ultimately your choice, right? So I want to try to make it easier for you. And I'm going to actually, in your file window, going to go ahead and upload the bonus pack that includes all of these tools. And these tools are also available in other places. If you can't download them here, if you have firewall issues or something like that, you can also go to that Facebook group for the Contact Center Virtual Summit and request them, and I'll make sure that you get this bonus pack. Okay, so I want to make sure that you have the tools you need in order to make a difference. It's not about knowing, it's about doing. We have to start doing better. All right, so this is finishing up loading in a few seconds. Okay, you should be able to download it right now. Hopefully it's in your file window under the chat window on this Adobe platform. I think if you click on it and click download files, you should be able to pull that down. Okay. So now I'd like to open this up to some Q&A. Again, we can continue this Q&A. I'm going to go ahead and jump in the Contact Center Virtual Summit Facebook group as well after this webinar if you have questions that we don't get into. But Chris, if you want to go ahead and join me, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone, just as a reminder, you can ask questions of Jim by using that chat box. It's on the right-hand side of your screen. And I do have some questions that came into my email, Jim. So one of the first ones that I have is, what is the most common types of development opportunities supervisors typically receive?
Well, and I think I kind of mentioned that a moment ago, and I'll reiterate, because what I find it being the very common thing are things that are given on how to navigate or be a better leader from a tactical perspective within that particular organization or contact center. So it's, hey, how to do things associated with processes and policies. It's, what is our, disciplinary, system and policies and practices? What is our, issues associated with, diversity and inclusion and all those types of things, which are more technical in nature. It's not about, hey, this is how you go about, really creating a stronger culture, within your team level or within your team. And how you actually understand the different types of, engagement and motivation, personalities and types. Like I even had this conversation yesterday with somebody when they were talking about somebody being competitive, and then when they explained that person's behaviors, and I'm like, well, reality is that person's achievement focused. There's a difference between being competitive and being achievement focused. So in other words, if I'm achievement focused, I essentially, when it comes to performance, I'll beat myself up because I want to do better, right? I'm achievement focused. Where if I'm competitive, I want to beat the person who I'm going against. There's a difference there. Those are different motivating types. And so when we start looking at people being able to understand the motivations of the people who are on their team, I need to understand the difference between being competitive and being achievement focused. Because if I put somebody who's achievement focused in an environment that has some type of competitive nature to it, they're gonna falter. Where for them, if I focused in on some individual goals and I started helping them to be successful as an individual, they'll blow the other people out of the water. So you have to really understand motivational factors. And that kind of training and development just doesn't happen. So if we start talking about KPIs and performance and things like that, unfortunately what most contact centers do is try to fit everybody in the exact same mode and model. And then we wonder why, this person who seemed like they had just so much potential is sucking wind, and they burn out and leave. When they probably, if they were approached appropriately and put in the right environment and reinforced and developed in the right way, probably would be the best performer you ever had. But we have to understand that's where leadership comes into play. That's not about, hey, this is disciplinary action. No, it's being able to address that person where they are with their needs, help them understand how we can help them fulfill their needs at the organization. So it's got to be beyond the technical. Unfortunately, that's what we see most often.
Jim, this might be an odd question, but something that just struck me as you were going through everything, because I firmly believe in what you're saying too, that there has to be, it can't just be an event or just go to this class or whatever, but how do you work to get buy-in from when everybody is such under huge budget constraints all the time? How do you work to get the buy-in from the corporate leadership to be able to put a good practice into place so that there can be that continuing education and follow-up, et cetera?
Yeah, what you just said right there is even a long path. So I had shared some of the data and the information from Development Dimensions International. It's going to be in the slide deck that I think you're going to provide as a PDF. The reality is that you have to be able to present the information to the people who make those decisions. And here's another one of those things that's often a problem, is if you talk about people who are responsible for the contact center, oftentimes they haven't received the development that's necessary. And so they get into a position of power thinking that they don't need it either. And one of the things that's most vitally important is that if you have a leader that's committed to ongoing development. If you have a person at a senior level who thinks they know it all, that's a dead end. I mean, quite frankly, it's a dead end. They're not going to buy into the fact that, people need, leadership development. And so going to them is not going to help. It's going to somebody else in maybe even higher in the organization. But you have to start capturing this type of information and sharing this type of information, because as I showed all of you on this call, every single KPI you measure, everyone is impacted by that frontline supervisor. So if we start talking about driving higher levels of performance, both from an efficiency and an effectiveness perspective, we can tie it all back to the supervisor. And we just have to start raising awareness in all of this.
Easier said than done, for sure.
It is. This is not a simple answer. I wish you're right. So I don't want to give anybody any false expectations. This, much like developing the leadership skills, is difficult. Changing the culture to be one that is development and learning focused is extremely difficult as well.
I think that is That is very key. Another question that we have is, what is a key factor in contact centers that are better at developing their supervisors than others? That's kind of a good tie-in question.
Well, I think I just alluded to it. It is having those people at, the decision-making level, the ones that are the heavy influencers, to come to the realization, that they need to do something different than has been done. Now, that goes back into the whole common practices thing, because oftentimes the saying goes that we can't pull out what hasn't been put in. So think about that from a knowledge perspective. I can't pull out of my head what has never been put in. So if we start talking and thinking about, well, we need to develop our frontline leaders. We need to do a better job of that. Well, then how do we do that? Well, then we start looking at others that are similar to us in the contact center industry. It's like, okay, well, what are they doing over there? What are they doing over there? Because we have to put something in order to pull something out. But the problem is, as an industry, we suck at it. I mean, we go back to the traditional model of, hey, let's build a training course and put them in it. That's not how you develop leadership skills. That's how you do the tactical stuff. Here's how you keep us out of court. Here's how you use the system. Here's how you, deploy our FMLA. All that stuff is pretty, simple, but not developing leadership skills, because we have to close the gap between what we know and what we do. So it's a knowledge and a behavior connection that needs to happen.
That very well said. Well, I think that is the last question that we had. But I would like to thank you, Jim, for this very informative webinar. It was great. I appreciate it and learned some things, so I'm sure everybody else did too. I wanted to remind the rest of you that the 2019 PACE Washington Summit is going to be held September 22nd through the 24th at the Intercontinental on the Wharf in Washington, D.C. Our registration and hotel reservations are open, and other information about the summit can also be found on the PACE website. If you're not a PACE member, don't forget to check out all the other membership opportunities that are on our website. We'd be happy to talk with you about that. As I said, this recording of the webinar will be available on the PACE website in just a few days. Again, Jim, thank you very much, and we hope to see the rest of you at another PACE webinar, national, regional, or chapter event very soon. Thank you all so much for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.